Welcome to 1920 by Omar Cuellar. The year was 1989. The sky over Bennington, Vermont, hung gray and opaque above me, as if it shared my grief. I walked with my head bowed through the desolate streets, my soul in tatters and my heart drowning in thick sorrow. I had just left my best friend's funeral, and the image of his body lying in the coffin kept hammering at my mind. I had never seen a dead person before, and that sight had sunk deep, like an invisible cut that wouldn't stop bleeding. I felt the unbearable weight of absence. I would never again hear his laughter, share secrets, or argue over trivial things. Loneliness was now my only companion. The air was heavy with dampness, and the sky threatened to unleash its tears at any moment. My footsteps echoed on the wet pavement as I wandered aimlessly, letting my grief guide my feet. Bennington stretched out around me like an empty stage. Its old houses seemed to watch me in silence, their windows like lifeless eyes. I couldn't shake the image of my friend in his coffin, his hands crossed over his chest, his face still, serene, and untouched by the pain his departure left behind. Every corner of the town stirred a shared memory of him, and now those memories stung like thorns lodged in my mind. Amid that sepulchral silence, a soft, delicate melody slipped through the bare trees. I stopped. It was a pure, ethereal sound, coming from a piano. The music danced in the cold air, momentarily breaking the oppressive melancholy. Following the source of the melody, my steps led me to a side path lined with rusted wire fencing. Ahead, isolated amid neglected fields and overgrown weeds, stood a solitary farmhouse, one of those that seem abandoned to the passage of time. The house, though beautiful in its old structure, bore clear signs of neglect. The paint on its facade peeled away, and wild grass grew unchecked around it, partly hiding the fence. The windows, coated in dust and cobwebs, reflected the leaden sky like broken mirrors. Yet the melody continued to flow from within, drawing me in with an almost hypnotic pull. That's when I noticed movement on the front porch. There were people there. I approached cautiously and, through the weeds, made out two cameramen filming a couple in front of the house. My heart skipped a beat when I recognized the man. He was one of my favorite Hollywood actors. I'd seen him in so many films that his gestures and expressions felt familiar to me. He was arguing with a young woman, and though I initially thought it was part of a scene, something in the intensity of his movements put me on edge. The argument turned violent within seconds. The actor shoved the woman roughly, and she fell to the ground. My heart raced. I hesitated for a moment, thinking it must be part of the script, but what happened next shattered me completely. The man lunged at her and began beating her mercilessly. Then, in a brutal and unexpected act, he raped her right there, under the watchful eyes of the cameraman and mine. A knot of horror tightened my throat. I looked at the cameraman, hoping for some sign that it was all a sham, a cinematic setup. But their expressions were cold, impassive, as if it were entirely real. A wave of dizziness hit me, and, unable to hold it back, I vomited into the bushes. The grotesque sight and my helplessness overwhelmed me. Logic tried to claw its way through my muddled mind. "It's just a movie," I repeated to myself. Yet a lingering fear kept me from acting. I wavered over whether to intervene, to help the young woman, but the thought of bursting into a film shoot paralyzed me. The confusion was so overpowering that I convinced myself it had to be fiction, until the actor looked up and his eyes locked onto mine. His face, once rehearsed and controlled for the cameras, twisted into a grimace of rage. He stood abruptly, pulled up his pants, and strode toward me with purpose. My legs refused to move. I tried to step back, but terror rooted me to the spot. From a distance, he drew a star pistol and, without hesitation, fired through the rusted wire. I didn't feel the impact. Only the sudden warmth on my forehead and the sight of my own blood gushing thickly over my trembling hands. The pain came later, like a distant echo. I collapsed to the ground and, with great effort, crawled until I found a gap in the fencing. I hid in the tall grass, my consciousness fading amid my racing pulse and the ringing in my ears. Time lost all meaning. I don't know how long I was unconscious, but when my eyes opened again, the light had shifted. I struggled to my feet, dried blood crusting on my forehead. The house was still there, but an absolute silence reigned. There was no trace of the actor, the woman, or the cameraman. I stumbled away, leaving the house behind as if fleeing a nightmare. But something was different. When I reached the town, I noticed details that didn't match what I knew: old-fashioned cars, shop windows displaying items from another era, the clothes of the passers-by. Somehow, I was in Bennington, but in a different time. I didn't question it. My dazed mind was focused only on helping the young woman. I made my way to the sheriff's office, its wooden facade looking like something out of an old book. There, with a trembling voice and halting words, I recounted everything that had happened. My story was met with skepticism at first, but the severity of my wounds and my shaken state convinced the sheriff to launch an investigation. More than 3 months passed in a relentless manhunt until they finally caught the rapist. He was imprisoned after a short but decisive trial. During that time, my life intertwined with the young woman I'd tried to save. Her name was Evelyn, and she was now pregnant with her attacker's child. The bond that formed between us was unexpected but profound. Our shared tragedy tied us together beyond reason. In time, the child was born, and Evelyn and I decided to raise him together. We married in a simple ceremony, vowing to care for that little boy and ensure he never learned the horror of his origins. One quiet afternoon, though, Evelyn shared a detail that chilled me to the bone. She confessed that on the day of the assault, she had been living alone in the farmhouse with that man who raped her. There was no one else in the house. So who had played that melody on her piano? Who had struck those notes that lured me to her home? The question hung in the air, like the final note of a forgotten song. And though we wanted a logical answer, part of us knew there were things we'd never fully understand. Our second child was born in 1922. The end.